In the Hearts of Men by Prosser 132, Chapter 5, Compulsion 3, Choice. Aster was not thinking about the past few minutes. He would think about it later, when it wasn't so delicate, when the edges of the memory were worn down from their glass-sharp newness. Then maybe he wouldn't cut himself on how much he'd risk by asking. What he had, how much he could have damaged without knowing, might still have damaged anyway. Not thinking about it! Aster thought firmly and stopped thinking about it. Nick and Tooth waited in the center of the room, worriedly studying the globe on which each believer was marked by their own tiny light. The globe was attuned to all of their beliefs, not just Nick's, and so was a good deal dimmer now. Tooth had lost quite a bit of belief, even if she'd won some back. Even that was a temporary measure. She still didn't have her fairies back, and the belief she'd kept would continue to be chipped away. Now that Sandy was gone as well, it would dim still further. "Jack!" Tooth said loudly when she caught sight of him, and Baby Tooth, poor thing, was going to have that name forever now, Aster reflected, waved to her larger self. Jack looked a bit like he was under a spotlight, but as Aster watched from the corner of his eye, Jack straightened a bit. "Oh," he began hesitantly. "Hey! Are you all right?" Tooth said, darting over, and though Jack flinched, he didn't skitter away the way he had from Aster. Aster pretended that didn't make something ache in the center of his chest, because if he thought too closely about it, it began to make him think about what he was not thinking about. "I'm okay, I'm okay," Jack said, evading the question. He edged nearer Aster, away from Tooth. She'd always had a problem with personal space, Aster knew, and the strange weight in his chest eased a little. Are you?" Tooth's expression spun through a whirlwind of responses. Pain, grief, fear, sorrow, a flash of anger that Aster knew wasn't directed at Jack, and a final bittersweet stillness. "I will be," she replied and reached out, patting Jack's cheek. Jack didn't move, but she pulled away quickly, and Jack relaxed a bit. "I see you stole my fairy, again." "Not theft if she came to find me," Jack replied, beginning to grin. "Sorry I'm the favorite." Tooth hid her smile behind her hand, but wasn't entirely successful. Baby Tooth chirped in agreement and nuzzled it closer to Jack's cheek. Nick gave Aster a strong look, glancing towards Jack and back again. Aster shrugged. Sure, Nick might want the full drum of what had happened, why Jack had run. That wasn't Aster's story to share. Some things in his life were not bloody guardian business, he thought a bit crossly, and looked to Jack himself. Jack was watching him, head tilted just the tiniest bit to the side, a subtle tension to his face. "You want to go first, or should I?" Aster asked, because he had to. Jack swallowed and closed his eyes for a second before nodding. "Yeah, I'll go first," he said, surprising Aster a bit. "What are you two speaking of?" Nick asked, striding over. Aster cast a glance towards the globe watching the lights, and tilted his ears towards the conversation. "Don't know what's on Bumman's mind," Jack said. Aster twitched involuntarily, always a little annoyed by the nicknames. Frostbite had backfired spectacularly, but as that was on the list of things he was not thinking about right now, he considered it no further, and Jack's voice was a little more cheerful when he continued. When I was... The sound of a wave through the air. The faint knock of a staff changing nervous hands. "Yeah," Jack finished hesitatingly. "The sprites that have been causing all the trouble trying to make another blizzard." Aster's eyes, quite without his permission, snapped back towards Jack. "Which isn't even hard to stop anymore," Jack continued, shrugging. His knuckles were white around his staff, even against his pale skin. "I've got no clue why the hell they try again, but hey, I don't pretend to understand why they do anything they do. Also, turns out cartoons don't lie, because bad guys really are inclined to monologue if you give them a chance, and the whole 'let me detail our entire evil scheme' thing actually happens. In real life. Wild, I know." Aster snorted, and Jack's mouth cracked up into a smile. "So, good news. I know what Pitch has been up to. Everything else is bad news." "Meaning?" North said, staring hard at Jack. "He's been trying to take you guys down for decades," Jack said bluntly. "Bunny was supposed to go first, then Sandy. He's been... Well, I don't really understand how this works, but he's been making people resent Christmas somehow." Aster glanced at Nick and watched with a sinking feeling as his skin went gray. "So many years I have wondered," Nick said, slow and old. Aster thought with some alarm. Even now, hair gone white with time, Nick had always kept the same vigor given to him by his Cossack upbringing. For the first time, Astor could see the lines of centuries in his friend's face.
Why does unhappiness grow? Why disappointment? Why stress? Families fighting, theft, and...
Nick seemed to blink himself back.
And fear,
he added, last voice soft.
Ah, yes, I see. Fear of disappointment, fear of letting down loved ones.
Astor bit back his words, not that he was entirely sure what he would have said. Pitch had learned subtlety, apparently, once Jack had knocked his plan off course. Jack was nodding, frowning.
Now that you mention it, yeah,
he said, blue eyes gone distant in his thoughts. Can't tell you how many times I've seen shouting matches around Christmas time, but when I think back... And he tilted his head back as if to send his mind along the same lines. It wasn't that bad before. Like, yeah, very stressful time. I remember the 30s in the U.S. wasn't the greatest scene. He tilted his head back forward, eyes falling on Nick once again, and there was a bitterness there that Astor didn't quite understand, that flickered in and out of existence only just long enough to be noted. But it wasn't this bad even then.
I think you have the right end of stick,
Nick agreed gravely. So, Jack said, and Astor wondered if he knew what he'd done, the way he'd so quickly melted from the fragile stare and awkward shuffling to a sturdy and implacable capability. He dropped his staff into the crook of his elbow and began to hold up his 4 fingers, thumb curled into his palm. Pitch has fucked up Christmas, to the point where people don't even look forward to it anymore. He ticked down his index with his free hand. Sandy.
Yeah.
Down went the middle finger, and Astor flicked his gaze up from the hand to Jack's face. Grief was there, so much more than a few minutes' acquaintance should have lent him, and Astor wondered just how much of the conversation he missed between the two of them. How Sandy had so quickly and unerringly won Jack's loyalty like that. Why, he couldn't... He got himself off. Not thinking about it. Not yet. And Tooth's fairies were taken. And the memories. Tooth supplied, face gone wan. There was 1 finger remaining on Jack's hand, yet unbowed, and Astor swallowed.
We still have a chance,
he said, and the others looked to him. Nick's eyes suddenly so aged, Tooth's skin waxy and her flake drooping ever so slightly, and Jack. Astor didn't often bother to pay attention to the sense of hope that sat like a warm sun in his chest. It was like thinking about his upper arm. It wasn't independent of himself, and was so necessary to other more delicate workings that there was little reason to think about it on its own. It was handy sometimes when trying to look for something, and he used it most often on his actual holiday. The rest of the time he ignored it. He just didn't feel the good, the growing, the light. You could feel the bad, the dying back, the darkening loss. It was a constant flickering light, affected by the hopes of every person on this planet, human or otherwise. It could swallow him, and so he ignored it. There was little, after centuries of practice, that could catch his attention without his conscious effort. But between Nick, Tooth, and Jack, there was a little sun that broke through the discipline, that shone on him instead of from him. You could rely on that the way they were relying on him, and more than anyone else, he knew they needed some hope right about now.
Easter's tomorrow, he said, and watched the way Nick woke up.
He watched the way Tooth's feathers perked up, her flight rising half an inch. The way Jack smiled, the curve of his mouth curling up all across his face and baring his teeth.
A war smile.
He felt their hope blaze from them and let it join the light in his chest.
And I've been a bit lazy, it seems, he continued. Could use the spare hands if you think you can handle a real holiday.
Nick puffed out the way Astor counted on. You only have to hide eggs in woods, he said, sounding a little strangled. I have to enter each house all over the world all in one night.
Oh, please, Tooth scoffed. I handle the whole world every night.
You are fairies to assist,
North pointed out, turning to her.
You do not even go yourself.
Tooth flew nearer, almost poking his eye out with her nose. You don't even make the toys yourself.
Yo, a snicker.
Nick fell still. Tooth blinked. Astor glanced over as the snicker was joined with another, then another, until it was full-blown laughter with neither start nor stop. Jack was leaning on his staff, using it for support, as he laughed so hard that the sound was starting to leave his voice, leaving silent shakes the only sound of his mirth. Astor and Nick began to laugh as well and looked back when Tooth started giggling. Wow! Jack gasped out after a minute. Are you guys like this all the time?
Aster felt his mouth twitch, trying to grin, and he held it back. "All right," he said somberly. Jack smiled at him, so bright and alive, eyes blue and cheeks pink, yellow lights overhead gilding his hair, and Aster wondered idly how someone so pale could be so colorful before shooing the thought away. Unimportant, it didn't need thinking about. Aster let the smile through, a soft chuckle of his own, joining his friends, and did think about the way he'd felt not half an hour ago, that there was no more laughter in the world. How disappointed Sandy would have been had Aster wallowed in it. How glad that Jack was here and laughing with them. The hope in his chest was warm.
"Are you sure you wish our help, Bunny?"
Nick said, still chuckling.
"You let no one into Warren. It's difficult thing for you."
And like that, all of the warmth fled Aster's bones, leaving his frozen in place and still staring at Jack, who now stared back.
"Bunny?"
Judith said when the silence stretched on a little too long, concern in her voice. She dropped to the earth and took a tiny step forward. Yeah," Aster said, coughing a little and ripping his gaze away from Jack's, which had gotten steadily wider and wider,
Panic creeping in at the edges.
It seemed Aster was always fated to keep breaking things around him, he thought with some viciousness, and shoved his own panic down deep, along with all these thoughts that weren't making sense and intruding on what he needed to do. How quickly he could shift between resenting the guardianship to clinging to it like tree roots from a cliff dangling over a precipice. "Fine. Emergency all. Sides, I asked, yeah?"
"Bunny,"
Nick began, but clearly thought better of it when he caught sight of Aster's face.
"Very well. Let us waste no more time. Easter is depending on us."
Aster nodded in relief, then paused, tried to stifle the growing smirk that wanted to spread across his face. "Oh, I might," he said, staring at Nick. Nick frowned.
"What?"
"This is for the sleigh." With 2 quick taps and a slight twist of his own magic, Aster opened one of the quick tunnels and flung it wide, wrapping them all at once, even Tooth, before snapping it closed behind them. He had no idea which reaction was most satisfying. Nick's blunder of surprise, Tooth's shriek of terror, or Jack's sudden holler of delighted laughter. Aster just leapt and began to go. With the tiny modification he'd added, either you moved or the tunnel moved you. From the loud and stumbling rush and swearing behind him, Nick was finding this out the hard way. He never yet managed to make this modification go faster than himself, so he didn't tend to bother with it, but it was very useful for getting googs where they needed to go and, apparently, ushering others into the warren. Jack caught up, still laughing, and spun once, twice, flitting out of the way of boulders and other obstacles like he'd been doing it for years. Tooth was just behind him, wings working furiously to keep up, and she sent Aster a dirty glare. Aster just chuckled. They spilled out into the warren after a time spent like this, Jack laughing with joy and Aster chuckling occasionally, Tooth's giggles like music in the air when she couldn't contain them anymore. Aster paused. "So," he said, gesturing toward the wide plain where the tunnels left. "This is me warren." Nerves flooded him, like when he'd let Jack inside that first time. Emergency only, he told himself. He also told himself that it didn't much matter, Tooth's opinion of it, but... "Oh, Bunny!" she sighed, rotating slowly in the air. "It's so lovely. No wonder you hide it away." Aster relaxed a bit, but tensed up again when Nick stumbled from the tunnel they'd arrived through.
"Bunny, I will skin you for soup," he threatened loudly, pointing a finger. "Giant rabbit man soup. Do you hear me?"
Aster rolled his eyes. "You don't got a soup pot big enough," he said dryly. "Come and make yourself comfortable, why don't you?"
"Would be easier," Nick rumbled, "if you did not roll me from bone to bone."
"You can get back in, I'll be happy to send you a little more south," Aster returned. Jack snickers off to the side for not helping. Nick rolled his neck, the snaps sounding like firecrackers as he went, and it cast a look around.
"Too much green,"
he announced, and Aster relaxed all the way.
"Needs more red."
"That needs red like you need another plate of cookies." Aster fired back, eyeing Nick's stomach pointedly. "Now, come on, you go to..." A tiny sound. Aster fell still. "Money?" Jack said, and Aster held up a paw, ears swiveling this way and that. He'd heard it. He knew he had. He just had no idea what it was. He could hear the goog start to move, and rapidly. Tiny feet like the fastest drum beat, 64ths and 108ths,
and it masked the new sound as the herd began to drive itself towards them. Or was herded, Aster thought with a sinking feeling, and reached back, snagging one of his boomerangs.
"Bunny, what do you hear?"
Tooth demanded. Baby Tooth finally left her perch on Jack's shoulder, flying to where Large herself, and the two of them were about buzzing with tension.
"Something's stirring the googs up face,"
Aster replied, twisting to face the direction they were coming from.
"No idea what—"
The sound was louder now, more than audible for everyone else, and there wasn't a one of them that didn't feel the dread in their bones. Pitch had gotten into Tooth's palace, had dissolved Sandy into an obsidian mockery of his golden light. How could they have thought that Pitch wouldn't get in here too? Aster swallowed back the bile. Fine. Pitch had gotten in, was here, and this was it. At least it was on Aster's home turf. He lifted his boomerang, arm tense to throw. From his peripheral vision, he saw Jack adjust his grip on his staff and tilt his body forward. Nick heft his swords with an intent glare. Tooth rise another crucial inch into the air. "Hold," he said quietly, "until the last second. Let him think we're frozen."
"Will that work?"
Jack asked as the sound grew louder. "Pitch loves to believe he's won," Aster replied. "Let him think he's got us, and he'll leave an opening." Jack was going to respond, but then the googs poured into the plane, and everything stopped making sense.
Bunny!
Shouted the tamer of the googs, and barreled down the hill and smack in our Aster's middle.
Hop!
There was silence.
"Sophie?"
Aster said weakly.
"Sophie?"
Jack repeated, staring.
"Isn't that Jamie's sister?"
Aster looked over.
Yeah, he's one of the kids who hangs out near one of the lakes I freeze over,"
Jack said, stumbling a little.
"What the hell was she doing here?"
"Language," Aster admonished, then winced. Jack just smiled crookedly.
"Can't hear or see me, remember?"
he said, the words interrupted by Sophie looking up and saying,
"Bunny talk to who? Bunny talk to who?"
Aster's heart ached for a long moment. "All right," he said to Sophie, but kept his gaze on Jack for a moment longer. Jack's eyes had fallen to the tin lid and twisted a little, pain visible for a second before it smoothed out into a rueful grin.
"How did you get in here?"
"Shiny round,"
Sophie said, sounding very authoritative about it, hands buried in the fur in his middle. He picked her up gingerly, confused.
"A shiny... Oh, starshine," he said and looked at Nick. "When I knocked into you..."
Nick's eyes went wide in understanding, hands patting at his inner pockets.
"That globe is missing,"
he said, and had the good grace to look sheepish about it.
"When she picked up blanket, must have picked it up as well."
"Well, that's just lovely," Aster groused. "An ankle biter and me worried. We need to get her back before—"
Sophie wriggled and shrieked, and Aster dropped her out of surprise. Clearly she'd intended for that to happen because she caught herself on hands and feet and scrambled away, shouting the word, "No!" at a truly impressive pitch.
The googs parted around her, and she ducked behind one of the egg sentinels. Ruddy useless things, Aster thought sourly in their direction,
if they couldn't keep a child from waltzing in.
"Wow, Bunny," Jack said dryly. "What?"
Aster asked, more than a little defensive.
"I've got this,"
Tooth said, sounding very certain, and zipped over to the tiny girl.
"Everyone knows little girls love fairies."
Aster squinted, offended.
"Oh, are you saying—"
He was promptly interrupted by another round of shrieking, as Sophie didn't appear to like the still-bloodied teeth Tooth was keeping safe on her.
"Oh my God!"
Jack laughed beside Aster, sounding stunned.
"When was the last time any of you actually saw a kid?"
"A few hours passed," Aster protested. "Our brother was fine."
"He's also like 7, Jack said dismissively. "She's what, 3, 2? Come on, guys, this is not how you handle a kid."
Aster opened his mouth to argue some more. A tiny part of him hurt that Jack thought Aster had been a guardian for centuries. He could handle a tot just fine. Jack saddled over toward the egg sentinel and hopped up, careless. He looked comfortable here, like he'd spent years here instead of the grand total of half an hour over the past few decades, and it shut Aster's mouth in astonishment.
"Watch," Jack said,
grinning, and spun a snowball out of nothing before throwing it and
nailing one of the googs.
"Jack!"
Aster yelped, horrified, but the goog was fine, shaking the snow off. Sophie couldn't see where the snow was coming from and didn't appear to care, laughing a little at the stumbling goog. Jack threw another, and she followed that, giggling more until she was chasing the stumbling googs right into Aster's waiting arms. Then, gentle as the first snow, a single snowflake came to rest on Aster's nose, a bright, cheerful blue, before dissolving.
Aster had time to glance at Jack, startled before a laugh, surprised from his own throat and making no sense, but felt cold in the best way possible. The first drink of water on a hot day, the first breeze across a sweaty brow, the first sign of frost after a long, sweltering autumn. He laughed again, and Jack looked so satisfied he started to float. "Come on, Bun Bun," he coaxed. "Sure, it's work, but who said you can't have some fun?" Aster grinned, a bit helpless, and stood with Sophie in his arms. "What do you think, Sophie?" he asked the girl, who was staring at him with big eyes. "You want to help bake some goods for Easter tomorrow?" Her answering joyful shriek was all the answer he needed. Jack wished, not for the first time since they arrived in the Warren, that he wasn't sure, really. He knew he was still trying to process everything. Sometimes it sort of made him angry how long it took him to work through things, but never so much as now when everything was happening so quickly. Turned out, Bunny had some kind of measures in place for if he was running behind. There was a river that ran through the Warren, all bright colors and dancing dye, and they herded the eggs into the water. Sophie was surprisingly a great help in this. She adored Bunny with every little bone in her body, and it took all of 5 minutes for everyone to realize that it was mutual. The little girl barely went more than a foot from him, crawling all over and chasing eggs and shrieking her joy left, right, and center, and Bunny was right there for all of it. He caught her when she tumbled off stones and tossed her when he thought no one was looking, catching her again with a smile on his face that looked a little strange to Jack, like he knew he hadn't seen smiles that big in Bunny's mouth. He'd had no reason to since the past day. 2 days? Had been spent in pursuit of things that weren't quite what anyone would call fun. And before that, they'd not really had the time to exchange smiles either, not with Bunny's awkwardness and Jack's nerves. Yeah, nerves. The way Bunny smiled at Sophie when he thought no one was looking was still familiar to Jack somehow, like he'd seen its echoes in earlier grins and quirks of mouth, and only now got to see it in full glory. It was happy, and Jack, even amidst his own confusion and grief and every other emotion that had been tossed onto his lap, was glad to see it. Bunny was a good person. He deserved to be happy. Jack had melted into the background a bit, glad to do so. It was easier to chivvy eggs along into the vines that curled painted designs into the shells, if he didn't have to think about where Sophie was. He had had enough of people walking through him, not seeing him, for a while. It still stung about her brother in a way, and Jack didn't want to try and work through that right now on top of everything else.
That lasted until North cornered him.
Jack didn't realize he was there for a moment, focused on prodding a stray gaggle of eggs back towards the vines. They looked different from Bunny's normal batches. Jack was starting to suspect the guy hand-painted each one. There were millions here, though. There was no way that was true. But they were pretty enough in their own way. Jack had seen a lot of egg hunts in the last 40 years, though. He had to say he liked those better.
Jack Frost!
Jack was up and standing in an instant, hand tight on his staff and whirling on his heel. Behind him, the startled eggs sprinted where he'd been directing them, scared by the sudden movement, but he had no eyes for them.
Sorry,
North said, waving a massive hand. He sounded genuinely sorry for all that the motion was dismissive. It was weird. Jack didn't like it.
How are you doing?
Jack bristled a little.
Fine,
he said shortly. It wasn't like the eggs had gone far, and he was kind of annoyed that North had come to check up on him. The eggs are back where they...
Not eggs, Jack,
North interrupted with a chuckle.
I do not worry about that. You must have this in hand. You have done this many times, yes?
Jack jerked, and he stared up at the massive man.
What?
He said after a moment. You're kidding, right? Now it was North's turn to look puzzled.
You have not helped Bunny with egg hunts.
No, Jack drew out slowly. Was North crazy? Jack was pretty sure an emergency of this magnitude was just about the only thing that would make Bunny let anyone interfere.
Why would I... What the hell made you think that?
Language, North admonished, then winced. Jack couldn't help the rueful grin everyone forgot, but not everyone had the good grace to look ashamed afterwards. Yeah, I'm not really worried Sophie's gonna hear, Jack said and tried to move past it quickly. Seriously, though, you think Bunny would let anyone in here?
He asked slightly, oh.
Now Jack was wincing.
It's true.
And North sounded very self-satisfied.
I know this much. Don't either of you say.
Jack threw a glare at North, but it had zero effect on the self-satisfaction. It was only for a couple of minutes, Jack tried to explain, so I could tell him about the blizzards. It was... Business? Yeah. North nodded very seriously.
I see. It's why he carried you into my workshop with his old two paws. Yes. Business?
Jack blinked. Yeah, he answered, words dragging in his mouth. Duh! It was the baby back for 68, and besides, he's Bunny. He'd do that for anyone.
Would he?
North asked. Jack bit his cheek, but the anger was there anyway. Well, were you this much of a jackass to everyone? Jack demanded. Even your friends? Of course he would. He's a good person.
You misunderstand,
North said, still looking a little more smug than Jack could stand.
I did not mean you would not. I meant that you are friends, yes? And you are comfortable here.
Jack opened his mouth to fire off a response halfway through North's words, but paused. Comfortable? Here? But it was underground. It was so far from the sky and the wind and the clouds. His worm curled around her just the tiniest bit, and he remembered the way she'd answered his call, even that first time. Sunlight warmed the warren all over, as far from a dark, dimly lit cave as Jack could imagine. It wasn't enclosed. Never had been. And even when he'd been trying to leave as quickly as possible, it wasn't because he didn't like the place. He was just scared that he was going to be asked to leave. But Bunny wouldn't do that, would he? He'd asked them here to help. He'd called Jack his friend more than once. He'd hugged him, which Jack still couldn't think about too closely because when he did, he still felt the way it wanted to overwhelm him like waters rising in a well, sloshing over the sides and dislodging stones. Bunny wanted him here, and Jack hadn't felt once like running. He looked at North, who had somehow grown more smug in the seconds Jack had been lost in his head.
You understand what I would think you had helped before, nah? He asked. You are friends. He might not have needed help, no. He might have wanted company.
Jack was struck by that, and for a second wonder filled him. Wonder that he might have been wanted here all along. He could have tried to come back without an emergency. Would have tried, but everyone had said... Hadn't everyone been wrong, though? Jack's head was a muddle. Everything was running together. He shook his head like trying to clear it of water. No, I haven't helped him before.
It's not quite true either, North struggled. But no matter. Come, we have spent enough time chit-chatting. Let us return to work.
Jack nodded wordless, and North ambled off like he hadn't set Jack's world on its ear. The next while was a bit of a blur, but when Jack could stop the world from spinning quite so quickly, he stood watching millions, hundreds of millions of eggs marching into the tunnels. He stood beside Bunny, who was cradling Sophie near. She'd finally fallen asleep. Jack didn't really expect Bunny to say anything. They still had work to do after all. The eggs were painted, but now they had to hide them, and that promised to be the hardest part of all. Nevertheless, Bunny tilted his ears towards Jack and said in a voice as steady as a mountain, "Thank you." "What?" Jack blurted before he could think. "I said, thank you." Bunny snorted, still looking over the steaming parade of brightly painted eggs. "For your help. Now for coming back." Jack gaped at him. "Not sure I could have gotten ready in time without you lot," Bunny said, and then looked square in Jack's eyes, green like spring, like it was reflecting all the warmth in his irises. "So thank you." Jack swallowed, nodded a little. What else was he supposed to do? He sure as hell couldn't talk. "Let her get the tot home, though," Bunny added, and his ears drooped a little. "Can't let her oldies find them missing." He gave Jack a smile. "Got the last one of them, didn't we?" Jack nodded again mutely. 68 was in the past, but it was also right in front of his eyes, and it took a lot for him to swallow it down and say, "I think I've got this one, Cottontail."
"What?"
Bunny said, eyebrows rising.
"But won't she,
But Jack rolled his eyes, but wasn't really all that annoyed. "Watch," Jack said, and held his arms out. Gently, as if certain she would slip right through Jack's arms, and Jack didn't blame him for the thought. Astor laid her in Jack's hold. Still sleeping, she curled into him, and Jack tried not to hold on too tightly, even though her warmth and tininess were almost as nice as being hugged again. He held her steady and smiled down at her. "Jack?" He looked up, surprised, to see Tooth and North had arrived as well. They were staring at him, and he hitched Sophie up a little unnerved. "I don't get it either. he said to their bewildered faces. "When they're awake, it's like I'm a ghost or something. But once they're asleep," he shrugged gently so as not to jostle her, "they're solid. Or I'm solid, I guess." Bunny was watching him, a thoughtful gaze instead of the confusion of North and Tooth's. "It's 'cause I'm dreaming," he said, and reached out, smoothing a paw over her choppy blonde hair. "You can believe in anything when you're dreaming." Jack held still. Sandy's name went unspoken, but it hung in the air anyway. "How'd you figure this out, though?" Bunny asked after a moment, paw still on Sophie's head. "There was, a kid," Jack said, thrown. "Back in, I think it was 1889. Sounds about right. He was falling down a hill and knocked his head. I knew I wouldn't catch him, but I had to try. But he knocked himself out, and I caught him." Jack shrugged again. "I carried him back to where someone would find him and waited. He was fine, just out of it. But—" Bunny was looking at him, and Jack tried not to let it get in his head, make him floaty and blurry again. He hoped this worked, and they kicked Pidge's ass because he needed to have some time to think everything through. "Are you not helping hide eggs, Jack?" Tooth asked, concerned. Baby Tooth flew over, settled on the opposite shoulder from where Sophie's head lolled. "I'm just going to take Sophie home," Jack said and grinned. "I'll be quick as a bunny, don't worry." Bunny groaned, nor chuckled, and Tooth smiled back.
"Well, get started then," she said. "Find Bunny when you're done. He'll know what needs to be done."
"You got it," he said, and looked to the guardian in question. "Where's my frostbite?" Bunny said, and pointed towards one of the tunnels. Jack felt a tiny change, like a static charge, and thought that the tunnel would probably work like the one that had gotten them here. The magic felt the same. "I'll hurry back, yeah?" Jack looked back at Bunny, and his face was suddenly drawn, ears tilted at a tight, uncomfortable-looking angle. "I will," Jack promised, and twitched his staff where it was clutched behind Sophie's back. The wind answered the silent call, picking him up and tossing him gently towards the tunnel in question. And then the magic had him. It sped his flight up the same way it had when they were on their wild slide in, and holy shit, that had been fun! Jack was so going to have to try and get another go one of these days, especially now that he might be allowed to ask. Jack counted the minutes whilst the wind buoyed him through, and barely 10 passed before he spun straight out of the open tunnel and into the night air. Burgess was peaceful below him, and Sophie shivered a little in his arms, out now as she was from the tunnel's warmth. On the opposite shoulder, Baby Tooth chirped softly, and Jack remembered that he wasn't exactly the warmest thing in the world. Best to get her inside quickly, and before she woke. Jack ducked down and tapped his staff against one of the windows to the house, judging from the myriad dolls and frilly things that this mustn't be Jamie's room. A bit of magic, amazing how ice could expand wood and loosen locks, and the window slid open, letting him in. He set her gently in her bed and smiled at the soft little snores that she made. Baby Tooth darted down and tucked a piece of hair behind Sophie's ear lovingly. "Think she'll be all right?" Jack asked Baby Tooth softly. Baby Tooth chittered in the same quiet tone. "For certain." At that moment there was a thump. Jack looked over, startled, to see Sophie had rolled right off the bed, sleeping soundly in a pile on the floor. He and Baby Tooth shared a glance before Jack shrugged and put one of the blankets over her. "Might as well keep her warm." "Okay," he whispered to Baby Tooth, hopping up on the windowsill and shutting the window gently behind him. "We should get—" "Jack!" Every cell in his body froze solid. He knew that voice, knew it in the bones and breath of him, but when he tried to place a name to it, nothing. There was no memory, just the same bland void as when he woke up from a dream. The sensation of loss, like he'd had something and it had gone missing. It was a girl's voice. He knew it. He knew it! Baby Tooth chittered at him and he shook himself. Her head was tilted to the left, mismatched eyes wide, and she chirped the question again. "Did you hear that?" he asked her. She shook her head. "Jack!" Jack snapped his head around. Off to the west, he thought, but growing fainter. He had to catch up to her before she disappeared entirely. She sounded scared. She needed him. He had to. "How can you not hear that?" he asked Baby Tooth, stepping off the ledge into the wind's waiting breezes. "She's calling my name! Someone knows my name, Baby Tooth!" A bewildered set of chirps, then a quick, alarmed one when he took off towards the sound. "It won't be long, Baby Tooth," he assured her, and something in his heart was singing. Someone was looking for him. Looking for him! "We'll be back before they even know I'm gone." A loud, frightened chirp as he picked up speed. "Thanks for the faith in me," he replied. 2 chirps, and the cadence of them screamed, "But Bunny!"
Bunny! That at last gave Jack pause. He hovered over his lake. He was alone except for Baby Tooth. He could call it that if he wanted, and tried not to think about the way kids would be swarming here in a couple of hours looking for eggs. They always held egg hunts near the lake, had for years and years now. And Bunny needed the help. Had said he needed the help. "The eggs are painted, right?" Jack said, and Baby Tooth took off from his shoulders to look him in the eyes. He spoke. "They're painted, and he's been hiding eggs for ages and ages. He won't miss me for a couple of minutes." Two very frustrated chirps and a poked nose for good measure. "Jack!" The voice sounded pained now, and Jack swallowed. "It's a little girl, Baby Tooth," he said, trying to keep his panic out of his voice. "A little girl, and she's scared, and Bunny will understand, he will," Jack insisted to her skeptical look. "It's a kid! He's a guardian, and if she's in danger and I didn't do anything to help her..." He swallowed. "Look, Baby Tooth, can I tell you a secret? You have to promise not to tell anyone." She looked a little dubious, but nodded. Jack took a deep breath. "I don't remember anything," he said very quietly. "I just woke up one night like this." He gestured to the sky where the moon would be. He didn't know if it had already risen and fallen, or would rise in the early morning. He'd lost track of time again. "And the moon was there and he told me my name, and that was it." Baby Tooth stared at him. "From what I've seen," Jack added, trying to gauge a reaction, "that's not normal." She shook her head so quickly, she bobbed in the air. "Right," Jack huffed. One thing to think it, another to have it confirmed. Well, it's not great, but I've learned to deal with it." "Jack!" He flinched. "I know her voice," he said, and he knew he was begging this tiny fairy in front of him to understand and helpless to do anything else. "I know it, and I don't know why, but I have to help her, please." Baby Tooth paused, visibly conflicted, her minuscule hands worrying over one another and her eyes wide. Then, to Jack's immense relief, she nodded and flew back to sit on his shoulder. "Thank you," Jack breathed. He smiled weakly. "Besides, I'm apparently friends with guardians now," he added. "Seems like saving kids is the kind of thing I should do." He felt more than saw Baby Tooth's nod, nestled as she was against his neck. "Jack, please!" He nearly gave himself whiplash turning around at that, and saw at last where the sound was coming from. Like a spot of earth had been erased from the landscape, there was a dark hole in the earth not far from his lake. He hadn't noticed it before, and he wondered if it was because it was new or if... It didn't matter. That was where the voice was coming from. He flew over and came to a stop above it, staring down. It was a gaping, clawed-open hole that swiftly descended into darkness. He couldn't see the bottom, but he could easily see how a kid could have tripped down there. Gingerly he descended and couldn't help the way his eyes snapped up above him, watching the stars until they were obliterated by the darkness. It was nothing like Bunny's tunnels. Those were warm and dry, lit by natural sunlight, and thick with growing things. This tunnel, and as he descended he realized it couldn't be called anything else, not with the way it curved around and leveled out before sharply descending once more, was, in a word, dark. Dark and tight and twisting, damp and cold in a way that even Jack could feel, and he pulled up his hood, trying to give Baby Tooth what little warmth he could. She was shivering against his neck. He tried to keep his breathing even, to ignore the panic in his chest at the thought of being trapped. He could hear whispers now, echoes of that voice, soft murmurs of, "Jack!" and "Please!" that made his jaw clench and his heart race. She sounded so small and so scared. His hands were tight on his staff. There was a dripping sound from the walls, and it echoed against the walls like only dripping water could. Then a faint sound, a brighter sound, but dulled. Baby Tooth perked up. "What?" Jack whispered, but it felt too loud in the enclosed space. "Do you hear that? Do you know what that is?" He could feel her nod, and her hands tugged at his earlobe, directing him forward. The tunnel led out at last into a cavernous space, and the shapes and layout hurt Jack's eyes. Staircases shouldn't work that way, doors leading nowhere, visions of upside-down rooms through archways. Jack remembered some kind of painting that had looked like this, and tried not to think too hard about it. Everything seemed carved from one massive block of iron, pitted and old. Cages and wire structures filled the room, with a great looming round shadow dominating the center, and piles of brick-like rubble all about. What little light there was dissolved into nothing long before it hit the ground, and Jack floated nervously into the room, wind as hesitant as he. The sound had resolved itself into faint cheeps and squeaks, and Jack realized it wasn't Baby Tooth's voice.
The fairies!
He breathed and spun up higher in the air to peer into the cages held off the ground. And, yes, the fairies were there, pressing up to the bars of the cages with wide eyes and frantic chirping. That meant... Oh no. He knew where he was now. He darted to the nearest cage, Baby Tooth taking off from his shoulder with a soft trill, and shooed the fairies back. Then he tapped his staff against the lock. Iron was a brittle metal when made to gold, and he broke it with another hard rap, frost crumbling the delicate internal mechanisms. He swung the door open and winced at the rusty screeching sound it made.
Come on! He whispered. Let's go, let's get you out of here!
The fairies shook their heads and twitched their wings. He sank an inch or so in dread when he realized why.
You can't fly anymore, can you?
He asked, and they shook their heads again. The belief was gone. Tooth was nearer to having no believers than he thought. The door swung back closed with a heavy-hearted clang. Baby Tooth's chirp rang out, and it sounded different from her sister's. Or more familiar, maybe. Jack turned, and she was struggling through the air, holding something long and golden, glinting even in the dim light of the room. Why she could fly when none of her sisters could, Jack didn't know, but it was an effort he could see. He reached out, and she dropped the cylinder into his hand with a soft squeak of relief.
Baby Tooth, what is this?
Jack asked, eyeing it, puzzled. It was flat on one side, with a tiny mosaic face on one end. A little boy, it looked like, with brown hair and eyes. No one he recognized, and even if he had, it looked like any number of other little boys. Baby Tooth tapped her own forehead, then gestured towards the pile of...
Oh, man!
Jack breathed. What he'd initially mistaken for piles of rubble or something, he now realized were piles of these rods.
Boxes? It felt too light for a solid metal. I have no idea what this is, Baby Tooth,
Jack admitted. She tugged on his hand and the cylinder both until he placed it in the pocket of his sweatshirt. Then she began to tug him away towards the massive shadows in the center of the room.
But the fairies,
he protested, squinting around the room, hoping he could see more clearly.
The little girl!
Baby Tooth patted him, where she held onto an index finger, and tapped her own forehead again.
I'm not making this up,
Jack said, frustrated. She shook her head and patted his sweatshirt pocket where the cylinder was. Then she chirped and began to pull on him again. Bewildered, Jack considered resisting, but he couldn't hear the little girl's voice even in whispers now. He needed to find her. He knew he did, but there was a feeling in his chest that she was safe for now. He could let her be.
Why he was thinking that when he was standing in Pitch's hideout, he had no idea. He had no choice but to trust it, though, and let Baby Tooth guide him where she wanted him to go.
He realized as they neared the massive shadowy orb that it was a globe, like the one at North's workshop. There were even fewer lights on this one, and he had no idea of if that was because it belonged to Pitch or if...
Would you look at that?
A voice curled out from the darkness, and Jack flinched.
A bird trapped in the caves. How unfortunate. We need to go,
Jack whispered to Baby Tooth, who nodded. It hurt his heart to leave all the fairies behind, but Pitch was here now, and Jack knew how to get in. He'd come back with the Guardians and rescue them, but they had to go, or everything would be over.
Leaving so soon?
Pitch asked, voice a mockery of kindness, and strode out from the shadows, suddenly stalking towards Jack. Jack flinched and leapt into the air away from the creep, and Pitch laughed.
Do you think being in the air will save you?
Pitch asked.
It didn't help save sweet, sweet Sandy, did it?
Jack snarled before he thought better of it, fingers twitching on the staff, and there was such a snap of rage inside him, cold as the depths of a crevasse.
I seem to have touched a nerve,
Pitch said delicately.
Oh dear, terribly sorry about that.
He gestured towards the globe Jack now hovered over, with all its tiny lights, so few in number but still glowing.
Do you like it? I was always more of a minimalist.
Oh yeah, I love what you've done with the place, Jack replied, rage overpowering the great factor.
Always liked the Goblin King myself.
Pitch's face twisted in distaste. Jack grinned. There
That was better than the smugness. Well, as great as this has been, Jack said, and Baby Tooth dropped into the hood of his sweatshirt, taking cues like a champ. I think I should be on my way, evil villains to thwart and all that. You think so simply, Pitch answered and looked quite bored with the concept. Good and evil, black and white. I've always preferred the shadows myself. Jack rolled his eyes. Okay, Drama King, he said. Good for you, but reality check, you killed someone! His shout echoed around the cavern, startling Baby Tooth and the other fairies from the sounds of it, and even Pitch looked just a shade taken aback. You killed someone who just brought people good dreams! Jack continued, the words rising even faster than he could swallow them down, and he had the disconcerting experience of knowing that he was digging himself into a deep hole, but being unable to stop himself. You saw the fairies in the... whatever goes on! You make people miserable! And you keep trying to hurt people! Hurt kids! Kids who never did anything to you! If you knew... Pitch began, but Jack cut him off with a strangled-sounding laugh. Fuck off! Jack spat. You're hurting people! If you think that's morally ambiguous or whatever, good for you! But you can fuck right off! Because your reasons aren't good enough to hurt innocent kids over! They never will be! You self-important, overdramatic bully! Pitch's scowl was a fearsome thing, but Jack wasn't fazed by it, wasn't afraid. Rage filled him up from the inside and left no room for fear. With a snarling sound like dead tree branches clacking in an October wind, Pitch slashed his hand down and black sand rose up in the shadows. Time to go! Hold tight! Jack yelped to Baby Tooth and let the wind take him. They shot towards the tunnel they'd entered through, and nightmares nipped at his heels all the way, always trying to grab him and drag him down. But the wind sent them spinning aside, jerking Jack out of the way and throwing him just out of reach. It was not a gentle ride, not in the slightest. And more than once, Jack smacked hard into a tunnel wall. The shadows were vast and dark, hiding low ceilings and sudden turns, boulders in the way. And all the while, Jack could hear Pitch laughing in the distance like he was strolling lazily along after him, assured of his victory. Leave us the fuck alone! Jack shouted at last, and the laughter was suddenly very near, right in his ear. Never. I will crush each one of you one by one, and you I will save for last, so you can watch them all go before you. Jack reached back to punch him, but Pitch had already slid away laughing still. Let's start with the obvious choice, Pitch said, and the shadows began to bleed away, light slinking in guiltily. I do always love self-fulfilling prophecies. Jack realized that beneath him, soft and green, was grass. The light was from the sun, and the sharp prickles beneath his heels when he touched down. No! He whispered, staring in horror at the broken, brittle colors of painted eggs. What did you do? Jack, Pitch said, and Jack turned to see him lounging in a corner where the sunlight wasn't so strong. His smile was triumphant. I think it's truer to say. What did you do? He melted away into the shadow, and Jack held very still. There was an entrance to the surface nearby, still open, and Jack walked numbly through it, the wind trying to pick him up, but unable to when he wouldn't let himself be moved. He could hear Baby Tooth chirp desperately in his ear, but didn't understand it any more than usual. It was outside his lake. Of course it was. And on the other side, on the grassy wide plain, Jack saw Bunny and North and Tooth. They didn't see him, turned away as they were, Bunny holding out an egg to one of the children. For the first time, Jack saw a child walk through someone else. He backed away one step, then another. In his head, like cracking ice, were disjointed words. I failed. I did it again. It's ruined. It's over. My fault. This is all my fault. He turned and, like always, ran. Aster was done. He knew it the second the child didn't make eye contact, and knew it before the cold shock of someone walking through him jangled in his bones. It was over. Easter had failed. Bunny, Nick said, and it was soft, and Aster didn't want to hear it. We're through, he replied, and in it was the final bitter sound of someone with nothing left to give. Centuries of work. Such a brief span in his life, and so bright.
It shone more clearly in his memory than even the great expanse of the Golden Age. He'd been a part of something, however reluctant he'd been at the first, and had invested himself in it. There was something good to be grown here, to be nurtured, and he'd given himself over to it in a way he hadn't done with anything, since his entire life had crumbled to a stop, billions of years past. He'd planted the seeds of his own hope there, amongst all of the little lights on this planet, and watched them grow. That someday he might return to the stars, that there might be hope, if not for him, then for everyone else. And now it was ash, like everything he'd ever touched.
Bunny, please,
Tooth said, laying her hand on his arm.
we could try.
You know there's not, Bunny answered.
Bunny,
Nick repeated, and his hand joined Tooth's on the opposite shoulder.
Stop it,
Aster said, tired.
There's nothing left.
He swallowed. He was trying so hard not to think about it, but he was staring his own death in the face now. When else would he be able to? Jack hadn't returned. Aster had seen Sophie at the egg hunt just before, Littleface determined, so Jack had gotten her home, and for a second relief had been all Aster had known. Sophie had gotten home safe. Then the nightmare struck. Even Nick had only just managed to roll out of the exit in time, away from the sharp hooves, and Tooth had a nasty gash down one arm. They'd poured into the tunnels and stomped all the googs to hell. As stars and suns keep his soul, all Aster could think at the time was that at least Sophie was safe. But then, where was Jack? There had been no sight of him before the attack, and it hadn't been all that long, Aster didn't think. Not long enough that he'd begun to do more than the low-level worrying he'd already done. Now, though, everything was ruined, and Jack was nowhere to be found, and by all the stars, Aster prayed that at least Jack had gotten away, hadn't been like the googs, trampled and broken on the floor of one of his tunnels somewhere, caught by surprise. A sob, racked and worn, worked its way out of his throat. Aster didn't try to pretend it was otherwise.
Oh, Bunny,
Tooth said, sounding sniffly herself, and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. Even the sensation of the blood soaking his fur from her arm didn't bother him. It felt appropriate, even. She began, then froze.
Tooth?
Aster said, turning in her embrace. She was staring off into the middle distance, as she did whenever she got too deep into the telepathic bond that existed between herself and her smaller selves. It had been centuries, though, since that had happened.
Tooth!
he's alive,
she said, and like she set fire to his blood, Aster felt hope race from her into the center of his chest with the force of a punch.
Jack's alive. He has my fairy with him. Oh, you are in trouble, little girl, when I find you.
It's alive,
Aster demanded, and Nick's hand was tight on his shoulder, and Tooth was tearing up, and there was hope in him again.
Where is he? Is he all right?
Hold on.
Tooth cried, eyes gone wide.
He what? He found Pitch's lair?
Aster flinched, and in his memory was the gaping slice in Jack's side, surely long healed over by now, but still fresh in Aster's mind.
She's not talking to me anymore,
Tooth said. It sounded so frustrated, it almost made Aster smile.
But she passed along. She knows how to get in. She didn't give me directions, but she knows where her sisters are, where the memories are. She's still with him, but he's going somewhere she didn't know where, but she's still with him.
Aster's chest ached from the hope his two friends were radiating.
There was the globe,
Tooth added.
In the lair, the lights are almost gone.
She looked at Aster, eyes focusing.
What do we do?
Aster swallowed, looking to Nick. Nick was watching them both intently and shook his head. I am unsure, he said, and Aster could have groaned from frustration himself. But there is still hope. Jack is alive, and there are some believers still. Nick frowned. We need to find Jack, but if he has run, may not be easiest task. What do we do then? Aster demanded. My holiday is ruined, the memories are gone. Chrissy isn't for months and months yet, and by then...
They'd all survived, true. The knowledge was like sunlight in his chest, but they survived to die a slow fading death. That was what happened when you were tied to belief like this. It was spreading even now. You could feel the darkening of the hope in his chest against the bright light so recently instilled. Some people hoped. Some people gave up. It warred in him outside of his control. Their dim and decidedly foreshortened futures hung heavy in the air.
We return to workshop, Nick said firmly. We treat wounds. He looked at Tooth's arm pointedly, and though Aster couldn't see the telltale shadows that would mark an infection, his heart almost stopped at the thought. We make plan, and then we fight pitch until no breath is left in our lungs. Slowly, Tooth nodded, and Aster clenched his jaw before nodding as well. To the end, then, he said, and reached up, clasping Nick's shoulder in return. Tooth reached for Nick as well, and though it felt like they were trying to stretch to cover a great gaping wound, there was some part of Aster that could see Sandy's face, smiling and confident. To the end, Nick and Tooth echoed. Aster took a deep breath and prayed that wherever Jack was, whatever was happening, that he was safe, that he wouldn't have to see this end, and maybe, just a touch selfishly, that Jack would miss him when it was over. It was added to the not thinking about it pile, and they left the lake behind. Jack sped somewhere. Anywhere that wasn't there. It was over. He'd failed Bunny. He'd failed everything. God, he'd been an idiot. He should have known. The voice must have been some kind of trick, some awful bluff pulled out of bitch's ass to lure him off, and he'd fallen for it like the fuck-up he was. He sped on and on. Time passed. Who knew how much? He was flying faster than he'd dared to in a long time, letting the wind scream along as fast as she wished, and his body tossing about as she went. The only thing he was careful of was his middle, where Babytooth had crawled down to, and even now huddled in the pocket of his sweatshirt, looking out with her wide blue and violet eyes. She was so small, so fragile, and Jack could never hurt her, never willingly. Then again, he'd promised himself he'd never... And he still had fallen short, not kept it safe. Land passed by beneath, mountains, marsh, sea, island, sea again, rainforest, then steppe, then coast. Rocks crushed under the ocean's weight, sea once more. The temperature dropped colder and colder, until they began to tickle at the edge of Jack's awareness. It was sunny here, and the light glinted off the snow and ice below. Antarctica was beautiful in a sharp sense, and ugly in the same way. It was a great vast nothingness, and it suited Jack just fine. The wind deposited him atop a glacier that jutted high into the air, and he took a seat, swinging his legs over the great abyss that dropped below him. Babytooth crawled out of his pocket and immediately began to shiver. "Oh, no," he said, and set his staff aside, cupping his hands around her to at least block the gusts of wind coming off from the edge. She huddled into his fingers, but she looked up at him with clear eyes. "Is that better?" She nodded. "I'm sorry, Babytooth," he said, and it came out hitched in the middle. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... I forgot you wouldn't..." He sucked in a breath and almost choked on it. "I should have stayed, should have been there." She patted his palm gently and shook her head, chirping softly at him. He began to smooth his thumb over the crest of her feathers, and she nuzzled into the touch. She chirped again. He really didn't know how he understood Babytooth. It was just kind of there, in context and widened eyes and little aborted gestures of hands. "It's not okay, though," Jack protested, her reassurance like a pin in his heart. "It's not! I should have been there! I should have been helping! And what was I doing? Chasing a voice that probably wasn't even real?" She chittered at him, scowling, and patted his sweatshirt pocket, reaching down to do so. The movement jostled the weight still occupying it. He'd forgotten about the cylinder. "I don't even know what that is!" Jack pointed out, more than a little exasperated. She tapped her forehead, then thumbed her tiny fist against her chest, then pointed at him. A quick, urgent trill. "I've never seen it before in my life!" Jack said, bewildered. "It's not mine!" The only thing he'd ever owned were the clothes on his back. Not even the sweatshirt, stolen and repaired and held together as much by a frost as it was by thread. And his staff. There was no way something so ornate and beautiful, so valuable, was his, especially if it was from Tooth's palace. She chirped, tapped her head, thumped her chest, cupped her hands against her mouth, and made a whispering sound. "My secret?" Jack said slowly. "You mean the not remembering thing?" She nodded, relieved, repeated the same 3 actions. Chirp, tap, thump. "It's my..." Jack said, but couldn't finish the words. The guardians all guarded something. Everyone knew that. Jack wasn't sure what they each guarded precisely, but he knew that it wasn't necessarily something physical. So who was to say the Tooth wouldn't guard something more than teeth? Jack knew the eggs Bunny hid meant more than just chocolate, but had never been able to put his finger on what. Why presents? Why eggs? Why golden dream sand? Why teeth? Why not something more? Do you mean my memories? He managed to say at last. The girl's voice. She was from... My memories are in here. Baby Tooth nodded, such relief in her eyes, and she rose into the air, wings beating furiously to keep her aloft. Jack stared at her. It was impossible. He had the answers to everything right in his pocket, and... She screamed! It was the highest pitched noise Jack had ever heard in his life, and he reached for her immediately, but the movement was too slow. Black sand had wrapped around her waist and whipped her away from him. He only just managed to snatch his staff up before the sand got him and scramble back, yelling for her helpless. Pitch rose from beneath like a tsunami, cresting into the glacier and sending black sand crashing up, a mockery of high tide. Jack pointed his staff at Pitch, snarling already, but then... Oh, God. Pitch held up his hand and Baby Tooth was wriggling in his fist, wide-eyed and terrified. Pitch said, smiling widely. No sudden moves, Jack, or I'm afraid the little bird will break her pretty neck. Jack froze. That's better, Pitch tutted. He strolled over, comfortable as if he stood in summer sunlight and not the freezing air of Antarctica, and Jack didn't move, just let Pitch circle him. You have been such a problem, child, haven't you, Jack? He asked. He clearly didn't expect an answer, as it was immediately followed with a long sigh. For years now you have interfered. You didn't even know what you were doing it, did you? Just thought you were doing the right thing. Jack hadn't realized the phrase, the right thing, could rhyme with so many nasty words. Must be the way Pitch said it. You've made your position absolutely clear, Pitch continued. Once I thought you could be swayed. The things I could have given you, Jack. Power, believers, a place in the world that has so harshly rejected you. That was your fault, Jack replied, and flinched when Baby Tooth gave a pained squeak. Ah, yes, the rumors. I did hear you wrangled that out to the spirits. Do not worry. They have been disposed of. Jack just breathed. He hated the sprites more than could be said, but he never killed them. Pitch, from what he could say, killed like he breathed. It is so easy to whisper in the right ears, Pitch murmured. Even in the Guardian's ears, if you know the right of it. Tell me, what must they think of you now? That ridiculous wizard thought you were quite the troublemaker. And why did the Tooth Fairy want your head on a platter? You don't really think a few days, but you didn't do much of anything, or change their minds, do you? Jack grit his teeth. I did want to thank you, though, Pitch added and shrugged, laconic. You all but made my efforts unnecessary. Seemed most of the world disliked you for one reason or another. Anyway, if you had just listened a little more, been a little less self-absorbed, why, we could have made quite the team. Never! Jack spat, unable to stop himself. You're a bad person! I'm not great, Jack faltered, but swallowed and steeled his nerve. I'm not great, but I'm not bad. I don't have to be, and I won't let you make me. He didn't dare lift his staff higher, but he tightened his grip. I might not stop you, but I don't mind beating you up before the Guardians squash you. Make it a little easier on them, yeah? Such a shame, Pitch simpered. And here I thought you valued the little fairy's life. So noble of you to sacrifice her for your cause. Pitch's hand tightened and Jack threw out a hand before he could think, terror rising up from his bones. No! Stop! Oh, Pitch said, sounding very satisfied. He circled Jack again and held the Baby Tooth up. Let me make you a deal then, Jack. You're remarkably reasonable when someone you love is on the line. He came around to the front once more. Stay out of this, and I will let it live. Give me your staff, and I'll give you the fairy. I'll even give you a moment to think. Jack's staff clattered on the ground at Pitch's feet. Pitch blinked down at it. Looked back up to Jack. "Give her back," Jack said through gritted teeth. His hands felt empty without his staff, like he'd thrown away his arm, but he didn't care. "They'll kick your ass without me. They've done it before. Give her back!" "And you will sacrifice the world for a fairy who means nothing," Pidge said, voice soft. He bent and picked up the staff. It looked wrong in his hand. "A fairy like your kind." "Give her back!" Jack snapped. "I gave you my staff. You got what you want. Let her go!" "You know," Pitch said thoughtfully, bracing the staff against his knee, "I don't think I will." With a great crack, he snapped the staff in half. Jack's ears were ringing and he was on the ground, and he realized the noise that still echoed in his head was his own scream. He never heard so much in his life. Not in 70, not in 82, not ever. It felt like Pitch had reached inside his chest and snapped something precious, something untouchable, in half. It burned, and it ached, and it froze, and Jack knew he was sobbing, but was unable to stop it. "That should take care of that," Pidge said, smack. "No, for the—" Another scream, closer to a shriek, and Jack looked up to see Babytooth and stabbed her needle-like nose into Pitch's hand. Pitch threw her, and though it took every piece of strength Jack had, pulled on that central hurt so hard he almost screamed again. He reached up and caught her in a gentle palm. "Are you all right?" He gasped out at her, the words more air than sound, and she nodded weakly. "Good. That's good." Something jabbed him in the middle, the sharp end of his own staff, he realized, and flipped him back, sending him tumbling and careening down the long, steep slope of the glacier. For one sickening moment, there was nothing underneath him. No wind to catch him. Where was the wind? Why couldn't she hear him? And then he slammed into snow and hard rock beneath. The air was frigid even by his standards. He landed in a crevasse. "I had thought to save you for last, but I'm afraid I simply can't take that risk. I think I'll keep this to remember you by," Jack called down, voice echoing off the walls of the crevasse. Above him, hazy though his vision was, he could see Pitch dangling the staff teasingly over the edge. "Don't you worry, Jack. I'll make sure to show the others before I kill them. Would it do any good to leave them some hope before the end?" The statement was still ringing in Jack's head long after Pitch left. It felt like years, but eventually there was a wriggling motion beneath his right hand, and he lifted his fingers, his entire body screaming at the movement. Babytooth popped her head out and tripped at him, shivering even in the comparably warm cage of his fingers. "Hey, Babytooth," he rasped out. She wriggled free, entire body shuddering as the cold air hit her. "No, don't. Stay where it's warm," he said, to no avail. I'll be okay. I'll get us out." She ignored him and crawled down to his pocket, where she began to tug. Her wings worked, but could no longer lift her, and Jack was zero help. Slowly she tugged the golden cylinder free and dragged it up before curling back into the curve of his palm. It rested heavy and accusing on his chest. "I don't think that's gonna help us," Jack said, taking care with the words so they didn't slur. His jaw hurt to move. Everything hurt to move. He wished very briefly that Bunny was here, but he shoved it away. Bunny had his own problems. He didn't need to worry about Jack, if he even would, now that Jack had ultimately failed to protect his holiday. Babytooth made a hissing noise and poked him hard in the hand. She then proceeded to chatter at him for 10 seconds straight without breath, looking more and more vexed as she went. Okay, he said when she drew breath at last. "Okay, what do you want me to do with it?" She mimed, sitting up. Jack winced, then sucked in a harsh breath at the way that made his abdomen tense up. She looked sympathetic, but mimed it again. Slowly, so slowly that it was almost unbearable, Jack pushed himself up. Babytooth directed him, and after scooting half a foot, Jack's back met stone. It was freezing, but it propped him up. "Okay," he repeated when he could breathe again. "What now?" She dragged his hand with her up to the cylinder and wrapped his hand around it, tucking his fingers in. Trying to not think about the pain of it, Jack lifted his other hand and cupped it around her. She was still shuddering, full-body shivers, but they were lessened just a little when she had something to break the draft of freezing air. She chirped at him, insistent. "Yeah, I got it.
Jack said, firming his fingers. Baby Tooth nodded, smiled encouragingly, and brushed her small, so small, fingers over the little face at one end. Light, bright, white, and stunning, and then... "Jack!" a little girl shouted from beneath a tall gray tree, long dark hair blowing in the breeze that never seemed to leave him alone. "Ma says to come down or you'll break your neck, and then where will she be?" "Jack!" a little girl laughed as he picked her up and swung her around. She was younger than the last time, but the right size to twirl and lift up. "Jack! Love Jack!" "Jack!" a little girl shrieked as he chased her over a hill. "Come on, we're going to be late!" "Jack!" a little girl sang, weaving flowers into his brown hair, so like hers, like their mother's. "Jack, king of green, where the leaves all fall, he's still a spring." "Jack!" Ice crack, and Jack held still. He should have known it would be too warm, too late, but he loved to ice skate, he loved the lake and how it froze over, and he thought, it didn't matter what he thought, she was in danger. It's okay, he said, holding up his hands. "Don't look down, just look at me." "Jack!" she sobbed. "I'm scared." She was. He was too, but he needed not to show it. I know, but you're going to be all right. You're not going to fall in." He tried to reassure her. The cold water beneath was a death sentence he knew, and she needed to hold still unless... we're going to have a little fun instead." "No, we're not," she wailed, but even if that was true, Jack had to hold on. "Would I trick you?" he asked and immediately regretted it. "Yes! You always play tricks!" Jack laughed, knew it sounded nervous, tried to ignore it. "Well, all right, not this time, I promise. You're going to be fine. You have to believe in me." She gulped, but nodded. "You want to play a game?" Jack asked desperately. "We're going to play hopscotch, like we play every day." He smiled at her, and she smiled back wobbly. "It's as easy as one... Whoa!" The ice cracked a little under his bare foot, so cold it hurt, and he almost fell over before catching himself. She laughed a little, and his heart soared. "2!" He hopped over again, and she laughed a little louder. "3!" And he was clear of the thin ice. He could see it now, could see how close she was to safety, and yet so far away. There was a stick nearby, shaped with a hook at the end, just like a shepherd's crook. Jack snapped it up and silently sent a prayer to God to thank you. It was precisely what he needed. "All right," he said, turning back to her. "Now it's your turn. 1!" And the ice cracked a little more. Her eyes went wide. That's it. He extended the stick as she whimpered in fear. 2, 3! He hooked her with the crook of the stick and swung with all the strength in his body, slingshotting her across to the thicker ice. His feet slid so cold they no longer even felt anything, and he knew he was over the thin ice that he'd just saved her from. He could feel it bending beneath his feet. He smiled anyway, and she smiled back for just an instant. The ice cracked. He dropped down. She reached out. "Jack!" A chirp. Jack blinked open his eyes and saw Baby Tooth standing on his cheek, peering at him. There was such a lightness in him now, wild and free and certain, so certain at last. He knew now, and the faint mist that had always been in his brain and had never quite paid attention to was clearing, and he felt like... "Did you see that?" he asked, and his voice was stronger too. Baby Tooth shook her head and squeaked when he sat up, falling into his outstretched palm. The pain was still there, but it was distant now, after aches almost. "I had a sister," he said, bringing Baby Tooth back up near his face. "I had a mother, I had family. I was alive, Baby Tooth, I was real." He never said it aloud, never acknowledged it, even in his own head, but he'd been so scared for so long, terrified that everything everyone else said was true, that he was just an expression stitched together from careless words and able to disappear in a puff of air at any moment. Now... His gaze lifted up to the sliver of sky that he could see through the crevasse opening and saw the moon twinkling above. "You and I are going to have a long talk someday about asking someone with words!" Jack called up, but so much of the anger was just gone. The moon had still abandoned him, still left alone with no answers, but Jack had been chosen from the beginning for doing the right thing. He wasn't what anyone said he was. His own words to pitch smacked him in the face. "I'm not bad," he murmured, and Baby Tooth chirped in agreement. "I don't have to be.
and I won't let them make me. Baby Tooth chirped again, and she sounded so proud! Jack felt his throat close up. Come on, he said, and got to his feet, tucking the memory box safely away in his pocket. He was still a little wobbly, but there was something in him now. Some old hurt healed over at long last, and it outweighed the damage Pitch had done. He hurt, still, but he no longer felt like he was dying. He'd been running and running for days, for years, ever since he'd risen from under the ice. He'd run from Tooth's palace, run from the caves, run from the destroyed and damning Easter, run from the Guardians, from Pitch, from Bunny. The first person who hadn't dismissed him, maybe not the first person to hug him, he decided, and Baby Tooth's hugs just before it definitely counted, but the first person to ask, to reach out, and Jack had run from that when Bunny needed him most. Jack took a deep breath. Looks like I've got a lot to make up for, he said, and Baby Tooth looked at him, puzzled but trusting. Well, it's a kind of a plan, sort of, Jack said. You with me? She nodded, determined. He loved her for it, and for a moment he saw another little face, brown eyes determined, scared, loving. A half-remembered song from a spring afternoon danced in his head. Emma, he said, blinking. Her name was Emma. A questioning chirp. Nothing, Jack said, shaking his head. Come on, into the hood. We're going to get you somewhere warm for a bit, then. He grinned. It felt right on his face. Oh man, this is going to be fun! He took a deep breath and lifted his face to the sky again. Hey, wind! Take me home! Like she'd been waiting for him, patiently watching for when he finally had his shit together, the wind screamed down and scooped him up. What little control he had of her was gone with the staff, but she knew what to do anyway, and bore him up into the waiting sunlight. They sped due north, and if Jack had thought they were going fast before, he'd been dead wrong. He almost couldn't see the ground below, it was blurring. And so he focused on Baby Tooth curled up into his neck. Hey, Baby Tooth, she trilled at him in answer. Can you, talk to your mom? Is she even your mom? A chirp and a distinct tweet that sounded as close to the word no as Jack imagined the fairy ever got. Okay, whatever she is, can you tell her... Jack swallowed. Tell her I'm coming? And tell the others? A moment of silence, then another chirp, sounding urgent and frustrated. Jack winced. That mad, huh? A commiserating whistle. We're making a stop first, Jack added. Baby Tooth poked him with her nose and told the question. I know they can't fly, but we're freeing all of your sisters first, Jack said firmly. I don't want them locked in there in case, Silence, and then Baby Tooth hugged the side of his neck. Jack lifted his shoulder a bit to make her perch more secure and press her tightly back, and they flew on. Night fell, the moon followed them, never once leaving the sky. Over Burgess, over the lake. It was his lake. He died in it. Now he knew why no one else had tried to claim it, even though he never had. And down into the deep hole they went. Only it didn't seem so dark now, or so frightening. Jack wondered why that was, then dismissed it. He didn't much care at the moment. The cage he'd opened last time was still full of fairies, all of whom stared at him with their wide eyes. Come on, guys, I'm breaking you free, Jack said softly. They twitched their wings and crowded again. I know, Jack replied, but you can at least... He looked around and his eyes wetted. Protect the memories, yeah? He said, and slowly they nodded. Come on, you can do it! He opened cage after cage, thousands of fairies staring at him, unmoving. They were frightened, and he didn't blame them. Still, he waved a hand at them, and they didn't even respond. Why aren't you moving? He demanded, frustrated. Come on, guys! Baby Tooth chirped urgently in his ear, and he turned, looking at the massive globe. The realization struck him like a body blow. The fairies weren't looking at him! On the globe, the lights were going out one by one. There were less than 10 now. He flew over, horrified, watching them. 1 in Africa, extinguished. 2 in Europe, gone. 1 in South America, 1 in Laos, and then... One light. Pennsylvania. He knew that spot. Knew where it was. Knew it was nearby. He touched it gently. Jamie! He started and turned. Okay, you guys, he said just loud enough for all the fairies to hear. Stay here, stay safe, we'll be back for you, I promise, he added hastily, and the soft chorus of frightened twitters. We will be back, Baby Tooth chirped excitedly. They're coming, Jack said with some relief. That's good. He looked over them all. We're coming back. Protect the memories, okay? You guys know how important they are. He swallowed. He knew now, too. One fairy nodded, then another. Soon there was a chorus of chirps and tweets that said more than he could ever put into words on his own, and he smiled at them all. "Let's get moving," he said, and sped towards the exit. Back through the tunnels, and they were just tunnels now, albeit dark. Jack wondered why he'd ever been afraid of them. Into the night air. He just hoped he'd figured this out before Pitch could get there fast. And there was the window! Jack crouched down on the sill, Baby Tooth peering through the glass with him. Inside, Jamie sat on his bed, holding a stuffed rabbit up and squinting at it like it had all the answers. Jack could hear him through the glass, and his heart hurt when the words registered. "What's going to happen?" he said, shaking the rabbit a bit and a stern look on his face. If it wasn't a dream, right? And you're real, you have to prove it. You told me to stay here so you could go save your friend, and I did. I did what you said." His little voice went soft, so much so that Jack strained to hear it. "I believed in you for so long," Jack begged. "My whole life. All 8 years, okay? That's a lot. So you kind of owe me now. Any sign. Anything. Please." A moment passed and nothing happened. Jamie dropped the stuffed rabbit to the bed, and Jack did the only thing he could do. It was hard without the staff, but he opened the window and slid inside. Jamie whipped around at the soft rattling sound, brown eyes wide in the gloom. "What?" he whispered, gently as he could, when it felt like he had no control of the frost beneath his skin. Jack frosted the window over and drew with a clumsy finger an egg. 2 squiggles, some dots. "No way!" Jamie breathed. Another window pane iced over, and though its lines were a little crooked, Jack was pretty proud of the rabbit he sketched out. Then, unsure if it would do it without the fine control of the staff, he pulled with his magic. The rabbit smoothed out to his relief and bounded off of the window into the room, hopping about through the air as easily as if it was on the ground. Jamie laughed with delight. "You're real!" he said aloud. "The Easter Bunny's really real!" He reached out to touch it, but it dodged its fingers only to nip his nose. It dissolved into a quick spray of snow, and Jamie laughed again in surprise. Jack sighed in relief, closing his eyes. One believer. One. But he still believed. "Snow?" he heard Jamie say. "Wait, Mom said Jack Frost?" Jack's eyes snapped open, and Jamie had spun around to face the other side of the room, looking around wildly towards his door. "He didn't!" Jack said faintly. Jamie spun back around so quickly he toppled towards the floor near the window. Jack lunged forward, a reflex that he knew was no good, but he had to try. Only his hands closed on a soft nightshirt, small arms beneath, and he almost stumbled with the surprise of wait! Jamie was staring through him. "Jack Frost?" he whispered. Not through him. At him. Jack swallowed. He started, lost his nerve, summoned it up again. "Can you hear me?" Jamie nodded, mouth open. "Can you see me?" Jamie nodded again. "You're Jack Frost," he whispered, still staring. "You're real." Jack couldn't help it. He laughed, just a little, only it wasn't a little, it was a lot, and Jamie was laughing with him, and oh God! Someone could see him! "I'm real!" Jack gasped out at last. "And the others! The Tooth Fairy, Santa, the Easter Bunny?" Jamie sputtered between his own giggles. Real! Jack answered. "Giddy with it! We're all real, all of us, I promise!" "Were you who they went to find? I knew they were really in my room! I knew I didn't make it up!" Jack nodded, even though something hurt at the thought of Sandy. "I was one of them," he agreed and sat Jamie back up. "We're real, I promise you, all of us." "You made it snow! In my room!" "I make it snow all the time! Remember the sled?" Jamie's eyes lit up. "That was you?" "That was me!" "Oh man, you're the coolest!" "Jamie!" A woman's voice called through the door, and they both froze. "Who are you talking to?" With zero hesitation, Jamie hollered back, "Jack Frost!" It was one of the best things Jack had ever heard. "That's nice, but you still have school in the morning," she said back, sounding amused. "Go to sleep before you wake up Sophie." "Ah, little sisters!" Jamie grouched, but it didn't last. Soon he was back to beaming at Jack like he was the greatest thing in the world. I like little sisters, Jack replied, smiling fondly. Jamie rolled his eyes and opened his mouth to say something when there was a loud crashing noise outside.
What was that?
Jamie asked, already getting up, but Baby Tooth chittered from the safety of Jack's hood. He knew who was out there. Come on, Jack said, hopping up to the window. I can prove they're real. Jamie nodded, standing up, and Jack held out his hand. Jamie took it, brave kid that he was, and let Jack pick him up until he was safely tucked under one arm. Jamie gasped when Jack let down, the wind buffering them, but whooped quietly before they landed safely on the street.
That's so cool,
Jamie whispered, and Jack grinned at him, setting him down. Then he gasped again.
Is that Santa's sleigh? That's it,
he heard North say as Jamie began to run over. He followed a little more slowly, nerves getting the better of him for a minute.
My magic is gone.
Reindeer scattered and Jack ducked back as one tried to trample him. Oh, there's Jack, he heard Tooth say, and he turned, shoulders hunching a little. She was leaning out of the sleigh, eyes wide. He's all right, he's okay. Oh dear, Jamie.
Cool,
Jamie said, the word drawn out as he approached.
The last light,
North said reverently, but Jack wasn't paying attention. He noticed who was missing.
It's you,
Jamie said, oblivious to the sudden tension.
bounding up to the sleigh. You're really real.
He spun on his heel, laughing, looking to Jack.
I know you said they were, but they're real. It wasn't a dream.
North and Tooth fell still. He can see you? Tooth said. What? Yeah, Jack said, trying to calm his suddenly racing heart and unsure of if he wanted to ask his next question. Where's... He forced himself to continue. Where's Bunny? North's face grew solemn, and for a moment Jack's heart sank. Easter hadn't... Oh, God, what if it had been enough to... Then, thank God, there was a scrabbling noise, and a gray blur leapt up and out of the sleigh, racing towards Jack, who caught it on reflex against his chest. Stole my milkshine, Jack! The gray bundle of fur shouted, and Jack stumbled back in surprise. Bunny! Who the hell do you think I am? Aster demanded, claws buried in the fabric of Jack's sweatshirt and clinging for dear life. Jack was alive, and he came back, and Aster had no idea if he was furious or relieved, anxious or happy. He felt like each breath sang out from his chest. Do you have any idea how worried I was? He yelled, and Jack winced. The movement telegraphed through Aster's tiny paws. Frostbite, we had no idea where you were, only that you'd gone. I thought you'd died, you great rat bag. I thought I'd lost you, and then you ran off, and you could have been halfway to Andromeda for all I knew. Why are you a rabbit? Jack interrupted, looking stunned. Aster shuddered a bit, knew Jack could feel it, since his hands cradled the entirety of Aster's body now. It had not been a comfortable change, but it had been a last-ditch effort, and he didn't regret it so much as he was embarrassed by it. I still lost us most every believer, he said, trying his best to make it sound matter-of-fact rather than painful. Energy conservation, mate. Jack folded to the ground, making Aster yelp a little as he went, and stared at him with such loss that it made his heart ache. I'm sorry, he murmured. That's my fault. I should have been there. I cost you all your believers just because I...
Not all of them,
Jamie piped in unexpectedly, and both Jack and Bunny looked up startled.
I'm right here.
The tyke smiled with an obliviousness of youth and said with a grin,
He made me believe in you, and all of you.
He scrambled over and crouched next to Jack, peering at Aster.
You especially. I thought maybe it had been a dream, he said, when you told me to stay to keep me safe. I'm sorry I almost stopped believing in you.
It was all right, Aster said on autopilot, but his brain had stuttered the walls. The not thinking about it pile had spilled over at last, buried him deep, the great number of reactions and thoughts and emotions hitting him all at once. Even as he looked at Jack, internally he was shrieking. Him? He demanded of his own heart, knowing it was futile. Now? Of all the bloody rat-bag timing! But of course it was Jack. Had been Jack for some time, probably, and Aster was just too daft to read the signs. Probably from the first, from 68. The way Aster had let him into his warren in 70. Nervous, yes, but trusting him in the place no one had stepped into in centuries. More than once, even. The way he'd chosen Jack over his guardian duty when the alarms had rang. the way he tended Jack's wounds himself instead of letting Yeti handle it, and finding out why the Aurora had gone off, the tenseness when Jack ran that first time, the lack of fear even high in the air, and then the hug and the worrying and the... Aster realized abruptly that he'd been staring at Jack, flabbergasted, for well over half a minute, and Jack was just staring back, looking more and more hurt as the seconds passed. Aster realized that Jack must think Aster didn't believe him. Didn't believe he would do that. That couldn't be borne. Not that, you're fine, Jack. Aster finally managed to stutter out. Thank you. Jack's face fell into lines of understanding, and Aster swallowed because Jack couldn't understand. How on earth could Aster explain, I fell in love with you, or that Puka only loved once in our long lives, or even more personally, I never thought I'd find you here on this planet in this time. I never thought I'd find you at all. How can anyone explain that? You're welcome, Cottontail, Jack said softly, and then with awkward motions, unsure of how to do this. And didn't that just make Aster's heart ache worse? Lifted Aster up and hugged him against his chest. Aster, unable to help himself, nestled in near, clinging with claws hooked in fabric in lieu of arms to return the favor. A huge thunderclap shook the air, and Aster flinched, Jack's hands pressing him tightly to his chest. Pitch! Tooth gasped out, the sky darkening even further from its night hues, and Aster shuddered. Like this, they were done for. At least they would die fighting. At least Aster would die knowing. Hey, come on! Jack's voice cajoled, and Aster looked up startled. Don't give up hope yet, Bun Bun! Aster's nose twitched, and he spared the brief second he needed to think that he wished Jack's annoying nicknames didn't feel quite so much like pet names. Still got hope in you, then? Aster asked, and opened himself to the sense of hope in his chest. Earlier, when he'd shifted into this tiny form, he'd closed off that part of him. It felt like losing a limb, paralyzed and weighty, but he couldn't bear it. Couldn't bear to feel the darkness creeping in from all corners of the globe. Now, it blazed in him, light, small, but even fiercer for their smallness. Jamie, still crouched beside them. Tooth and Nick behind them. Baby Tooth still tucked into Jack's hood. Jack himself. And it was like sitting beside a bonfire. It was so warm. Of course I do, Jack replied, grinning. We're the Guardians, yup. Can't give up yet. Aster heard Tooth's soft gasp, even over the rolling incoming thunder, Nick's comparatively quiet intake of breath. Aster, for his part, just stared. He wasn't sure he was breathing. I've got a plan, but we're going to need some more believers, Jack said, still grinning, and looked over to Jamie. You up for an adventure, Jamie?
I've been waiting for this my whole life,
Jamie replied, solemn, but there was still an excitement in him Aster could see in the way he vibrated. Awesome, Jack said, and shifted Aster's weight so he could push playfully at Jamie's shoulder. Let's go get your friends, then. Jack stood up, and Aster yelped at the sudden movement. He scrambled up and into Jack's hood on instinct, wriggling around, and he shared a quick look with Baby Tooth. She covered her mouth, but he still heard it giggle. He scowled. Stay there, Bugs, and hold on, Jack commanded. He eyed the sleigh, then picked up Jamie and deftly tossed him. He went with a great shout of laughter, and North caught him with a bewildered expression, almost fumbling him. Let's get moving, Jack said, and gestured with a hand. Where has his staff got to? Aster wondered, hunched over her shoulder. Sophie first! Then, size! Aster did not like flying. Historically, it went very poorly. Much less flight so uncontrolled and juddering, and Aster had no idea if this was how Jack flew all the time, or if there was something wrong, but he did not like it one bit! He tried to keep his swearing to a minimum, softened in Jack's ear, but Jack was laughing every few seconds at him, which sort of ruined the point of it. Ice guided the sleigh down the roads, moving quickly this way and that all over Burgess, as Jamie shouted directions, and one by one they acquired other children. Jamie and the tiny Sophie sat so far up in the sleigh that they were almost bounced out of it multiple times, laughing and giggling and having the time of their lives. Aster had no idea what Jack planned to do with the tots, but as their eyes realized what was happening, as their belief returned to them in great bursts of surprise, Aster could feel it in his chest, strength returning in gentle waves. One by one they were roused and loaded into the sleigh, each of them looking a bit stunned, but a lot excited! And he could feel Jack's flight steadying beneath him, the kids staring in his direction with wide eyes. I can see you, Frostbite, he said loudly to be heard over the wind.
I know!
Jack said back, laughing, but there was such giddy glee in it that Aster chuckled with him. Faster and faster they went, and overhead the great clouds of corrupted dream sand billowed, and for 1 second, just one, Aster pressed his muzzle against the side of Jack's neck, hidden from Baby Tooth's view, his small lips pursed in imitation of a kiss. The best he could do under the circumstances. "You all right there, Bun-Bun?" Jack asked, curving through one last turn beside the sleigh into a wide clearing of road. A good battlefield, Aster noted with some pride. No training, but Jack had good instincts. "Bud butter," Aster replied, pulling away a bit, twitching his ears so that it brushed against Jack's. "Let's get this over with, Frostbite." "I like that plan," Jack laughed. The sleigh spun and came to a halt, and Jack landed, graceful as ever, on the front of the sleigh. Aster and Baby Tooth both left the hood, and Baby Tooth stumbled down the long line of Jack's arm to his hand, where he held her out to Tooth. "Think I've got something of yours," Jack said cheekily. Tooth reached out, fingers trembling, and Baby Tooth leapt from Jack's hand to hers. "Thank you," she murmured, bringing Baby Tooth up to her face and cuddling her near. "You're wonderful, Jack." Jack coughed uncomfortable. It was very quiet, but Aster could feel it resting in the crook of Jack's elbow. "Cool," one of the tots said from her seat, red hair tucked behind her ear. Jack grinned at that. "I find myself unsurprised to see you here," drawled an unpleasantly slick voice from the shadows. Aster's ears swiveled before his head, and so he missed the precise minute where Pitch slinked out, but it was impossible to miss what he held in his hands. "Even so, I assure you it is a disappointment." Pitch tossed the halves of Jack's staff off to the side, looking disgusted with them. "Couldn't you have died in your hole like a good little coward?" he snarled. "You have no place here, boy." Jack snarled back, the sound ripping through the air, tilted forward, and short of Aster, who still sat in his arms, squarely between Pitch and the rest of them. "My place," Jack spat, "is between you and whoever you're trying to hurt." "Mine," Aster added, bracing his paws on Jack's forearm. "Mine as well," Nick said at the precise moment Tooth went to say, "Mine too." Nick and Tooth bracketed either side of Jack, and Aster thought that despite their ragged state, Nick's faded strength, his own changed size, Jack's lack of staff, and Tooth's lack of flight, they still radiated the fierceness, the protection that they'd sworn to uphold, whether officially, as had Nick Tooth and himself, or by his own damn choice, like Jack. All their choices, and even if the oath he'd taken didn't hang above his head, he'd still be here, Aster thought. A lot had changed in the last 500 years. He wasn't so good at hiding from his problems any longer. "Oh, very, very sweet," Pitch sneered.
Who is he?
Whispered Jamie from behind them, and Aster realized that Tyke was holding onto the edge of Jack's sweatshirt, peering between him and Nick on his left. Sophie was pressed to his side, staring. "The boogeyman," Jack replied, not moving his gaze from Pitch.
He's real too?
There was fear in his voice, but beyond that, a curiosity. No wonder he'd held on to his belief when all others lost hope, Aster marveled. Nick must feel the wonder, something fierce. "He's real too," Aster said softly, and looked down, wiggling a bit to see Jamie better, trusting the others to keep Pitch in their sights. Jamie swallowed. "I'm scared," he said, and it was almost more a statement of fact than of emotion. Puzzled. Still, Jack flinched even as Pitch began to smile, a languid and infuriating curl of lip. "As you should be," Pitch murmured, slunk even closer. All around, the black sand began to creep in, and Aster pressed nearer, his own fear in his throat, even as he fought it. Jack's arm tightened around him, and Aster found his words again. "There's nothing wrong with being afraid, Jamie," he said, voice firm, "so long as you don't let it stop you." Jack nodded, slowly. When Aster looked back up, there was an expression on his face, a new light in his eyes, a new tilt of determination to his head. "Yeah," he murmured, almost too soft to hear. "Don't let it stop you. Got it." Then louder, he said, "It's okay, Jamie. We're going to have a little fun."
Fun?
Jamie said, dubious. Sophie echoed the word. Jack began to smile. Of course, he laughed, and the sound was bright, startling in the looming darkness. Would I trick you? Then, in one swift movement, he set Aster down on the lip of the sleigh, lifted his free hand, and gave what looked like a wicked curveball directly at Bitch! Aster snapped his head around. What had Jack had in his hand? But was only just fast enough to see the aftermath. A slushy snowball straight through Bitch's face. Ah, explained the toss. Silence filled the air, seemingly caged in by the rising sand. And then there was a giggle. Jamie clapped his hand over his mouth, looking mortified, but Jack was grinning. Bitch just looked stunned. Let's go! Jack said, laughter in each syllable, and took to the air, diving forward. The sand leapt after him, and blue light like sunlight through glacial walls deflected it. Nick began to laugh too, and withdrew his swords, metal flashing silver bright in the darkness. To the end! He shouted, and to Aster's surprise, vaulted over the sleigh after Jack. Not an hour ago, he needed Tooth's help just to clamber into the sleigh. He threw 2 snow globes, and from them came rushing yetis, hammering away at the encroaching sand. Tooth's wings began to whir, and she lifted into the air. I can fly again, she said, joyous, and Baby Tooth chittered from her shoulder, taking off. Find your sisters, she said to the fairy, before twisting around and looking at the children and Aster. Keep them safe, Bunny. I have an idea. The memories? Aster asked, mind racing along. Exactly! If we could just remind everyone why they believed in us in the first place. That belief will come back. Aster finished, and her hope was sweet in his chest. Go, I've got the tin lids. She took off after Nick and Jack, beginning to laugh herself as her fairy zoomed off, and Aster turned to the kids, who stared at him wide-eyed. Sophie was squinting at him, as if frankly unsure if it was the same person she'd seen only the night before. What can we do? Jamie asked clearly the ringleader. Believe, Aster answered. Then a flash of blue. Jack's magic, still wild and untamed, flickered past, and he remembered the staff. Jack had always had it long as Aster had known him, and the 2 halves said a lot about why Jack's magic was so erratic. If they could just get it back to Jack. Though, if you want to get a little more hands-on, I've got an idea meow. Come on, said the heavyset girl in the back. Aster liked the look in her eyes, tough and fierce and so full of hope, and he smiled at her. Tell us! Follow me, and be careful, Aster warned. Jack will have me for soup if any of you get hurt. Jamie reached out and resigned to his fate at the moment. He didn't dare change back just yet with so little power available to him. Aster hopped up. Did you see where the soft went? He urged as the kids leapt from the sled. The sand ignored them, pouring toward the other guardians, growing hooves and manes and snapping teeth as it went. Jamie looked a little ill, and he stared at it for a moment. Focus on me, Aster said, and Jamie's eyes snapped back to him. Remember, it's okay to be scared, so long as it doesn't stop me, Jamie finished. Okay. Guys, who saw the staff? The boy with thick red glasses adjusted them nervously. I saw, he said, eyeing Aster as though he half expected to be bit. Where did it go, Monty? Jamie asked, excitement in his trembling fingers. Monty pointed off to the side near a car, towards a circle of sand swirling menacingly on guard. Aster could see a flash of wood through it and groaned. Okay, you lot stay here, he said, changing the plan in his head and leaping down to the pavement. I'm going after it. I'll bring half of it back. Go for the other half. Can only carry so much right now, you know. Are you going to be okay? Another boy asked, orange hat bright even in the dim light and looking afraid. I'm small right now, Aster said, huffing a bit, but I'm not helpless. Neither are you. You're never helpless. The boy nodded, the others joining him, and Aster twitched his ears. Stay safe and stay away from the sand. Okay, the tall, gangly girl said, and picked up Sophie, who was frowning more now. Come on, guys, stay near the sleigh. Aster turned, eyed the staff, and rolled his shoulders. Small, but not helpless, and maybe not small for long. Let's leave it the field, yeah? He murmured to himself and began to run. Whoa, look at him go! He heard from behind him, but he focused on his speed, on leaping past sand that curled after him now, and wasn't that interesting, Aster thought, the way it had ignored him when he'd been with the tots, but tried to stare him now. Very, very interesting. He skidded under one crashing sweep of sand and leapt up, pushing off it, leaping now from snap and curl to crack and twist, faster than they could twine around his little body. Being small had its perks for true, he thought as he dove, and tumbled past another reaching tendril and came at last to the 2 halves of the staff. He snapped one end up in his teeth, the only way to hold anything left to him, and turned with his unwieldy mouthful only to freeze. The nightmare sand had risen up high as the stars to Aster now and began to crest down. Bunny! No! Jack spun over, spiraling, arms outstretched in flight wild, and Aster could see he was too far away. What a ridiculous way to die, Aster thought, almost annoyed by it. The first to go, and not even in his own shape, no less.
Bunny!
Aster snapped around, horrified. Jamie had followed him, stars and suns, and was reaching out the... Only Jamie was nearer, and the sand struck his outstretched hand first. Aster skirted backwards in shock as golden light overwhelmed his eyes, brighter than any light had the right to be in all this, and stared as the nightmare sand, only seconds before twisting and writhing, burst in vibrant golden light. Sandy! Aster sputtered out as the sand wound itself in little saucers of light and big-headed little figures dancing around Jamie, who watched with wide eyes. Bunny! Jack said, scooping him up. What were you thinking? Oh my God! Then I grab your staff, Aster said back, heart thumping crazily. Did you see? Yeah! Jack said, looking away from him at last and over to Jamie, who was staring at his hands. What the hell? I think that's why it's avoiding them, Aster said, urgent. There was a dizzy wave that flooded him. Bunny? Jamie said, scrambling over the golden sand following. Jamie, Bunny gasped out. Go! Get the others! You can change everything! Pitch had noticed the light and turned from his battle with North and Tooth, stunned. Go! Jamie, go! Jack urged, and Jamie was off like a shot, the golden sand following him, the black sand edging away from the light. Aster didn't sit and gape, though, wriggling free from Jack's hold and falling towards the ground. Wait, Bunny! Aster closed his eyes, reached inside himself, and twisted! It was his own feet that hit the ground, his own paws, and height and shape by the seven stellar winds, and that was such a relief that he began to laugh, even as the black sand swirled back around and focused on them. Whoa, he said cheerfully to the sand, and threw his boomerang straight through it, scattering it into nothing. Bunny? Jack said from behind him, sounding a bit thunderstruck. Aster turned, ears first, and made a sweeping gesture at the car. The belief's coming back, he said simply. Get your staff, Frostbite. We've got a job to do. Jack nodded, blue eyes glittering in the dream sand's light, and Aster grinned, the fierceness in him only rivaled by the affection. What are you doing? He heard Pitch snap, sounding furious. Do your job, you wretched wasteland dust! Aster turned back and could see Jamie had safely reached the other tots, their eyes so full of hope and wonder and happiness that it almost glowed from their skin, their own lights. The lights. Got it! Jack said, and Aster looked back. Jack put the two pieces of his staff together and blew on the join. Blue light flared up and sealed the crack. The wind picked up suddenly, just strong enough to make Aster stumble, cold but not unpleasantly so. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, and when he looked up, his eyes were glowing, the same brightly intense blue as his magic. Aster swallowed. Jack had always been strong from the first. Now, though, he looked like he could take on Pitch alone and win! Do you think Sandy could... Jack asked, stepping up beside Aster, swinging his staff in a lazy arc. Reckon there's a chance. Aster nodded. You get the thoughts. They're our best ticket now. I'll get the others. Jack took to the air, and Aster, unable to help himself, added, Stay safe. Jack blinked, but the smile he gave was glowing in a different way from his eyes. You got it, Cottontail, he said, and took off for the tin lids. Aster turned to Pitch himself, who had taken to smashing at Nick and Tooth with the broadside of a wicked-looking scythe and bombed his boomerangs. The Yetis and the ankle-biters could handle the sand, as far as he was concerned. Oi! He called, and Pitch looked over on reflex. This is for me goons, you Mongo! He threw, and Pitch ducked under it. Aster had expected that and thrown the other half a second later right in the direction Pitch ducked. It slammed into his stomach with a satisfying thump, and Nick whooped as he took another swing with his sword that Pitch only just avoided. Looks like my fairies are doing their work, Tooth said with chiming merry laughter, scoring a good long line across Pitch's shoulder. Aster grunted in answer, catching his boomerangs as they returned and lining up for another throw. Before he could, there was a shout of delight from behind him. Jack's voice, joined by the voices of children, and a tendril of golden sand slicked past Aster like lightning, blazing along the ground and winding around Pitch's ankle. "What?" Pitch shouted, but that was all he had time for. The sand jerked him up and around, whipping high into the air and dangling. Aster slumped in relief before turning. Only one reason for that. "Sandy," he called, trying to keep his voice calm as his eyes sought out his old friend. "Don't get sweet time, you trouble rat bag." Sandy, short, round, endlessly patient, and endlessly kind Sandy, waved to him and signed an oval, hollowed out, but with the addition of a single perfectly round dot. "Hello," it said in broken characters, just as he'd said goodbye, and Aster had to swallow back the tightness in his throat. Sandy turned, created a bowler's hat, and doffed it to the clapping and cheering children. "Sharp outing," Aster finally. Jack had floated over, eyes in the air, firmly on Pitch, and he started when Aster gave him a friendly shove. "Yet though," Aster said, "I didn't even get to do anything cool this time," Jack said, sounding put out about it. Aster stared. "Are you serious?" he said after a moment. "I wanted to at least give him a good sub," Jack said and looked over. His eyes were twinkling. "You saved us all, Frostbite," Aster said, then turned and looked at the children. "Yeah, and you believe us. But I reckon you could have done anything more cooler than that." Jack, who'd clearly intended it as a joke, colored. It was a lovely look on him, Aster thought, even if Jack ducked his head and mumbled about, "Oh, no, don't you dare," Aster said, reaching out and hooking an arm around Jack's shoulders, pulling him in for a rough one-armed hug that he hoped wouldn't give him away too badly. "Not yet. None of this was your fault. You and I are going to have a long talk about when it's the good oil to run off, mind you," Aster said, feeling Jack wince and hugging him tighter. "But it's not your fault." He looked up at Pitch, who was wriggling desperately to get free. "Reckon we ought to deal with whose fault it is now, though." "Yeah," Jack said, sounding dazed, and Aster let him go. He stayed pressed against Aster's side for a moment, though, unmoving, before floating away. Sandy was looking at him thoughtfully when Aster looked over, but Aster didn't waste time worrying. That would be for later. "If you'll do the honors, Sandy," he said, mostly because he knew it played right into Sandy's overdramatic pudgy fingers, and he was inclined to indulge a friend who'd just risen from the dead. Sandy, predictable as ever, in this at least, lit up and nodded. He raised his hand, paused as if thinking it over, then nodded once more and whipped it down. The thin strand connecting him and Pitch swung up and wide before slamming Pitch head first into the ground. "Oh, man," one of the kids said, staring from underneath his thick, wiry, natural hair. "That looked like it hurt." "Hopefully," said the tall, gangly girl, huffing. "Mommy!" Sophie cried, wriggling free at last from the girl's grip. "Hop, hop, hop!" Aster crouched down, and she ran into him, little legs pumping, before tripping into his arms. "Told you I'd be back, ankle biter," he said softly. Sophie just nestled closer, tiny fingers in his fur, and he smiled. For a second, Aster let himself relax. Tooth darted over to Sandy and picked him straight up, whirling through the air with him in her relief. Nick looked deeply amused and clapped Sandy hard on the shoulder as he passed, and came to stand beside Aster and Jack. "Is this what it feels like?" Jack asked, and Aster looked over. "Like light in my chest? Is that what being a guardian feels like?" Aster and Nick traded looks. "Guardians of Center," Nick said, placing his hand on Jack's shoulder gently. Jack flinched a little at the contacts, but didn't immediately begin trying to backpedal. "Each of us, we are different. Sandy guards dreams, for dreams are his center. Dreams of future, dreams of impossible things. I guard wonder. Always have I saw discoveries. Exploring, seeing new things is very exciting," Nick chuckled. "I have me hope," Aster chimed in, picking Sophie up. "I can feel it in me just too. Lights. Every light on the planet, mate. Tooth, she guards memories." Jack finished, and Aster blinked. "Yeah, I found that out the hard way," he shuffled. "So, what's mine?" "Reckon that's something you'll have to find out on your own," Aster said, shrugging. "We all did." Jack nodded, looked at the children, who celebrated with the golden sand. Jamie talked animatedly to Phil, who looked a bit surprised, but very pleased at the attention. Sandy had given Pitch a face full of his dust, and now the Night Air King dozed, dreaming, apparently, of butterflies. "Ahem," Jack said, looking at the slumbering shadow of a man. "What do we do with him?" "We got to look him away," Astor said, firm about it. "Got an idea if you lot are with it listening, but reckon we ought to get the tin lins back to bed before the roadies burn down the town."
Excellent idea, Nick said, then called louder. All right, everyone, to sleigh.
The kids began to clamber in, but Jamie hung back. Jack leapt into the air and landed neatly beside him in a crouch. Astor walked over. Sophie had dozed off in his arms, and so he took great care not to jostle her.
"But will I ever see you again?"
Jamie said, looking at Jack with big brown eyes and the strongest case of hero worship Astor had seen in years. "Of course you will," Jack laughed. "You're my first believer, right? Can't forget you. I'll be back with the snows come winter time, promise. Matter of fact," Jack said and leaned back with a mock thoughtful expression, "betcha I can wrangle one more snow day. What do you say to that?" Jamie's eyes lit up.
"You good? Oh man, you're the coolest!" "Snow day!"
cheered the heavier girl, who looked like she could probably throw a wicked snowball. Astor liked them all, and resolved to leave an absolutely ridiculous number of googs here to come next Easter. "Snow day it is," Jack said, laughing. "But you gotta get home before your parents find you missing, okay?"
"Deal!"
Jamie said and scrambled into the sleigh. The reindeer came slinking back, looking ashamed of themselves, and the Yeti hooked them back up to the sleigh, scolding them in Yentish. Another snow globe opened a portal to the workshop, where they began to march through, Pitch held securely between two of the burliest of them. He'd be out until Sandy said he wasn't. Phil handed Jamie a piece of paper before he went through, which was tucked safely into a pocket. Astor had no idea what that was about, but he reckoned it wasn't his bizzo. One by one they dropped off the kids, and as they went, a gentle but thick snow began to fall, Jack's eyes glinting blue whenever the lights from the street lamps caught them. Sophie, Astor tucked in himself, though she rolled off onto the ground a second later. "Some tots," Astor shrugged and put a blanket over her. Jack was putting Jamie to bed, inexpertly but determined, and Astor popped into the room. They were the last two to be put to bed, and the sky was beginning to lighten, even through the thick cloud cover Jack had created. Jamie was asleep in his bed, and Jack had tucked a stuffed rabbit in with him. Now Jack was standing and watching him, a fragile look on his face that Astor hoped was a good thing. "How you going?" Astor asked softly, and Jack tilted his head over. "I'm okay," he replied, just as quiet. "I'll be better when Pitch is gone for good, though." Astor sighed and wished anyone else could have given Jack this news. "We can't do that, Frostbite." Jack looked over fully. "What?" "He's tied to belief, same as we are, and he has his role to fill." Astor sighed. "Best we can do is knock him out, keep him sleeping. Keeps him out of trouble. So far as we can tell, Saul Luna has hopes that he can be saved, and—" Astor shrugged helplessly. "Can't exactly tell the bloke not to hope, can I?" "Can he? Be saved, I mean." "I don't know," Astor answered blunt. "Reckon anything's possible if you believe hard enough." Jack nodded, though it was reluctant. "Won't happen today, at any rate." Astor sighed. "Come on, let's go." He opened a tunnel with 2 taps, and they descended. The snow was too thick now to want to open the window and exit that way. When they were in the tunnels, though, Astor paused. "Frostbite?" "Shoot, Bum-Bum," Jack said and smiled. Astor rolled his eyes but swallowed nervously. It was too soon. Jack was just getting used to the idea of people liking him, wanting him around. Astor couldn't, and more importantly, wouldn't force his feelings on him. Jack deserved time to grow used to this new life he was entering, to a world that could say the name Jack Frost with joy and not with irritation at best, loathing at worst. Astor could give him that. Astor wanted to give him that. Besides, they were spirits. They had time. Still, I want to be very clear with you, Astor said. Jack looked over, eyes wide, nerves evident in every movement of his body. 1, you can call on me whenever you need me. The 3 knocks were never intended as a one-off, mate. I will always come for you. Jack nodded, eyes gone even wider somehow. 2, and as he spoke, Astor reached out with his magic, changing the way the Warren's wards work. You are always welcome in the Warren, whether I'm there or not. No matter the time, even on Ruddy Easter, you are always welcome. Jack must have felt the changed magic, the way his own was suddenly at home here, because he whipped his head around, staring at the walls. "At last," Astor said, taking a deep breath. "You can call me what you want, but if I have a choice in the matter, reckon I'd prefer you call me by my true name, Astor. if you don't want. Jack's gaze traveled back to Aster, and his heart in his throat. Aster waited. Jack bit the inside of his cheek, because if he didn't, he might cry. He did not want to cry in front of Bunny Aster over something dumb like being told he was wanted. Okay, yeah. Bunny's Aster's, Jack reminded himself firmly. This seemed like kind of a big deal to him, so Jack was going to do his best to remember. Ears twitched, but his mouth grinned, so Jack figured it was all right. Good. Glad we got that sorted. Then Aster was hugging him again, full-armed, and Jack felt so full of light he could only cling on and hope it never ended. Things weren't done yet. Pitch would have to be locked up, whatever that meant, and he had his memories to work through, and that was without working through the past 3 days. Had it really only been 3? For the first time in a long time, though, since before he'd gone under the ice and come back up, he wasn't alone. And that, Jack thought, as he buried his face in Aster's fur and held on, would make all the difference.